Check. 1, 2, 3.
The D. Brief. This is the D Brief.
Your guide to Detroit.
Your guide to Detroit's arts
and entertainment scene.
This is the D
Brief.
Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm your co-host. My name is Seth Ressler.
And I'm Becky Scarcello.
And people who have been listening to this podcast for a while know that I'm new to the Detroit area. I've only been here for a couple years.
Right. And I'm a native.
You have been here your whole life. And on this podcast, there are a lot of neighborhoods that we talk about, but there's one that's come up quite a bit recently because of everything that's happening with Ford buying the train station and all the cool restaurants moving in. That is Corktown.
Yes. Although it has tremendous history, and honestly, my whole life that I've lived here, I've heard about the history, and of course was the site of Old Tiger Stadium that many people grew up going to, and it's just a rich place and very diverse, very stable, I'd say, although it has changed a lot.
So in this episode here today, we're going to dive into the history of Corktown because it is so important and because I don't know anything about it, and I think
it's important to understand what shaped what's going on today.
So we have joining us today the executive director of the Corktown Experience. The Corktown Experience is the owner of a historic site known as the Corktown Workers Row House. And there's actually an exhibit that is over at the Detroit Historical Museum, only going to be there for a little while longer.
Go check it out.
Only until July 7th. But that exhibit is called The Journey to Now, and it focuses on the Corktown Workers Row House. So we wanted to welcome to the podcast Tim McKay. Tim, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
So you have lived in Corktown a long time. When did you first get there?
We first moved in 1983. We had worked on a house for about a year before that.
And how has the neighborhood changed in that time? I mean, what was it like in the early 80s when you
In the
first
early
moved in?
80s, I had driven through, I was working in Hubbard-Richard, which is a neighborhood further west, closer to the bridge, the Ambassador Bridge. And I had driven through the neighborhood, and of course I'd gone to the neighborhood during Tiger Stadium efforts of baseball and football. So I was kind of familiar with it, but it didn't resonate in any way. I was a little worried when my friend said he was buying into it, thinking it was going to come down, because surrounding it, there had been demolition for decades.
Wait, he thought what was going to come down? Tiger?
The whole neighborhood.
Oh, the whole neighborhood was
right.
Just
Tiger
gonna be done.
Stadium might have remained there because they needed parking lots, so a lot of houses went down for that.
So let me ask about this, because I've never really understood this, because nowadays when we think about a big baseball stadium going in, it's always touted as, oh, this is going to be a great thing for the area and all the nightlife that's going to surround it, and we throw tax breaks at it. That was not the case with Tiger Stadium back in the day.
Tiger Stadium grew along with the neighborhood almost simultaneously. That lot was owned by the Woodbridge family, Michigan's second governor. And they had a public park there called Woodbridge Grove. And they played baseball when it was a two-word game in the 1850s.
Right.
It was 2 words? I didn't know
Two
that.
words, baseball. And then it morphed into, and it was a public area outside the city. And there was only Grand Circus Park that was the only park. So it was a privately owned, Woodbridge family owned this behind the Haymarket, which was also at that corner, Woodbridge Grove, and that's where they played baseball. And it grew into then Bennett Field, where it became professional baseball, one word. And then that morphed into Navin Field, and that expanded. And it was great around the neighborhood up until the 1930s. When automobiles were purchased by the expanding middle class. And then the demands on traffic, parking, started to make an impact on the neighborhood. Demolitions for parking lots. Michigan Avenue being widened, so half of Michigan Avenue destroyed. So Tiger Stadium had this sort of balance with the neighborhood. It wasn't like how they build stadiums now where they go into an empty place and have this huge parking lot. That wasn't the case. It was organic. It grew as the neighborhood grew.
And so business people could make more money by creating parking lots than they could
and families
business.
Who bought houses rather than have a tenant,
Yeah.
It was easier to park cars for the season of baseball and football.
Right.
So they started tearing down stores, churches, schools, houses
Wow.
by some of the people who lived there.
Wow.
Now, when we think of Corktown today, we think about that stretch along Michigan Avenue that you're
Sure.
talking about. I mean, was that it back then? Or, you know, what was the whole neighborhood? What did it consist of?
It was solid buildings along Michigan Avenue. If you're familiar with the Detroit Institute of Bagels, that was one storefront of a 3-story building with 3 bays of storefronts, and down to one bay. It was destroyed to just be that one room where they have the bagel shop. Michigan Avenue was solid Victorian buildings that were commercial and residential above, small retail.
So I think we should be grateful for what remains, but also recognize how much more was there that
Right.
was lost. But that's what's pretty important about the workman's house, right?
The Workers' Row House it's remarkable. It was built in 1849, that it still is there
In its original location.
in its original location.
Which is where?
Wow.
So, I mean, what is it?
The
and where
Workers'
is it?
Row House is roughly a half a block off of Porter and 6th Street, which is Porter and 6th. On the northeast corner is Most Holy Trinity, which is an anchor and, in fact, the beginning site of what became Corktown, the core of Corktown. Corktown was settled by the Irish Catholics, essentially. They weren't necessarily welcomed in downtown where the Protestants were. The Protestants tolerated the French a little bit. So the Irish came out to live in the area before they moved their church to that site. And they literally moved their church to that site. And the term Corktown really comes from the idea that those Irish people who came here didn't necessarily live in a particular district. The connection of these people who didn't really know each other was the fact that they left Ireland through the port of Cork. So they were Corktowners in that identification.
Sure.
Wow. So you're moving in the 80s.
Yep.
The train station was still running at the time. that you
Train
were there.
station was still running. Baseball was playing at Tiger Stadium. Football had left and gone north to the Silver Dome.
Was the train station vibrant at that point?
It wasn't vibrant,
No.
but Amtrak was using it.
Yeah.
It was kind of vacant, but it was being used.
So explain that to me. How does a train station fall apart? I guess. I mean, I don't.
It was neglected. It just wasn't used, and it just fell apart because the fellow who bought it didn't do anything with it.
Correct.
And just let it sort of rot. But actually, it's in remarkable structure. It's really strong. It's together in a lot of ways. There's cosmetics that are expensive.
Yeah.
That need to be done, and Ford is doing that, which is exciting.
Wow. And then Tiger Stadium is there, obviously, until the late 90s.
Tiger Stadium was abandoned in 1999, last game in September of that year, which some of the neighborhood kind of had anticipated was going to happen, even when Tom Monahan owned it. And so, but people in the neighborhood understand its rich history. People in the neighborhood who were working on the development corporation were also trying to strategize economic development strategies to infill on this sort of vacant Michigan Avenue. A lot of stores were gone. So we were looking at the train station, which to Detroit, that's our Ellis Island.
Right.
The history at the site of the baseball stadium, Tiger Stadium, and then the rich history of the neighborhood itself. We were trying to shape it into cultural tourism, economic development strategies.
Tell me a little bit about those efforts.
We recognized the history that we had, and we tried to shape each site into some strategy of saving them some way or another. We worked kind of incognito, trying to embarrass the owner of the train station into transferring ownership in some way or another. We pull.
Let's talk about that. How do you do that? What's the strategy?
We go to meetings and embarrass him and say, why don't you do something with it? We can't be torn down. It's too important of an edifice. It was designed and built by the same people who built the New York Central Station.
I thought you were going to say
community meetings.
You know, cut holes in sheets and pretended we were ghosts and walk through the building.
We had thought of that, but that didn't fly too well. You know, we worked on Tiger Stadium. We shaped the Tiger Stadium Conservancy, got a foundation to fund that, and we worked a strategy to save we tried to save the existing stadium structure and convert it into housing, keeping the stadium sort of intact, realizing some of it was going to have to be destroyed, but saving that site because of the social history, the impact on middle class and working class people that facility fostered. And one of the most important things about the historic designation of Corktown is it is about the worker. It isn't a place of mansions where magnates lived. Most people are more interested in those large mansions than they are little cottages.
True.
Except if you assemble them in one area, you can kind of generate some interest. And once you start to kind of pull out the stories of the working class, they're the people who built the city. They're the people who made the industries function on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
The worker.
So the workers' row house is really, its uniqueness is its commonality, right?
Exactly.
At the time.
It's the ordinary.
Yeah,
it's about the ordinary. And the house is very ordinary. It happens to have sort of elements of Greek revival, but it's pretty simple.
Yeah. But unique in that it's one of the very few left.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the only one left.
Yeah.
There are a couple of 2-unit. This is a 3-unit. The workers' row house is a 3-unit. There used to be 4-unit. There used to be 6-unit. And they were scattered site throughout the east and the west side. They're all gone. There are a couple of 2-unit houses scattered site throughout the city, just in odd places. And there's one on LeBrois Street in Corktown.
Wow.
So I don't want to make any assumptions here. When we're talking about the workers in Corktown, what industry or industries are we talking about?
Well, in the beginning, it was basic industries like cigar making, mills and foundries. And then with the railroads and shipping kind of growing because of the Erie Canal, and then the trains coming into town, it was all kinds of big industry. Lumber was first, and then it expanded into the natural resources like copper and iron and steel. But there were candle making, lamp making, shoemakers, cigar
Hosiery.
makers.
Yeah.
Right.
And I presume at some point the automotive industry.
Oh, of course. Southwest Detroit is the neighborhood that built the automobile. And that's what, in the Motor City National Heritage sort of designation, Southwest Detroit, the Baker Street trolley, which ran through Corktown all the way to the Rouge plant, was all about transferring workers to the Rouge plant. It's all about the auto industry.
Now, you touched on getting historic designation. What I thought was interesting, December 1984, you said was a pivotal time.
We had lived there. We were still a little nervous. In the late 70s, the National Historic designation occurred, but that doesn't guarantee the neighborhood's going to stay intact or a building will stay intact. Local history designation does that.
Okay.
The preference is no demolition once you're designated locally, and it's organized by the commission, and the zoning is impacted by that.
And so how did you make that happen?
That was through a community effort, and the Historic Commission, there's a designation department. Bill Worden, Debbie Goldstein was really active in that. She had worked on the Canfield designation before that. And then there were people who were buying into the neighborhood who also worked on the effort for the historic designation. We did surveying, some volunteers surveyed the neighborhood and talked to and block party effort to convince them it was a good thing. It wasn't going to be, forced, zoning issues like color combinations and stuff like that, and that it was a good thing and it would stabilize the rest of the neighborhood. And once that sort of got approved, it was a sigh of relief, and then you knew that we could start investing on making the neighborhood work. And that led to projects like changing a transfer station into 3 separate lots and moving houses to those lots from areas that were going to be where they were going to be demolished.
Wow.
In other words, once you've got this designation, you no longer need to worry about people just blowing stuff up and
no regard.
Starting
Exactly.
over. It may get converted, it may get updated or changed into something.
To some extent, it stopped the demolition to create parking lot revenue for Tiger Stadium.
Right.
Which really started in the 1930s, which was also brought around by the fact that folks were moving into the neighborhood by the turn of the century, coming to Detroit for the automotive industry. Latino, Mexican, and Maltese families started in droves moving into the neighborhood.
So history aside, when you know that Tiger Stadium is moving out, right? What is the feeling in the neighborhood, besides the guys who own the parking lots? Because it's not like this is driving a lot of restaurant business or bar business or...
Well, it did.
There were bars, yeah. Nemo's.
It was predicted that, Corktown was over with.
Really? So people in Corktown were worried?
No, not the people in Corktown. Outside the community. Outside the community, people say, well, it's probably just going to dry up and blow away. But folks in Corktown, the bars that were happening, like Nemo's and McShane's was Shelley's, I think, at the time, they started saying, well, we're doing shuttle buses to, the Joe Louis, so let's do shuttle buses to the new stadium.
Yeah.
And in fact, that worked pretty well and continues to work pretty well. It's a little bit more confusing at the new little pizza arena, but there's an attitude there.
Yeah.
But no, the neighborhood said, we'll make it. And small bars and restaurants sort of held their own. There was one restaurant, and I think it's hilarious. The guy said, I'm done, I'm working hard. And he worked very hard at his restaurant. But he also owned a lot of parking lots behind his restaurant on Michigan Avenue. Tore down a lot of houses to get that. And so he changed his name of the restaurant from, I can't remember what it was actually, to Oblivions. And he was kind of interesting, not Irish, not Maltese, but another ethnic group. But it was a little slap on the Irish, and also a slap on the fact that the stadium moved downtown, and his parking lot revenue was just gone, and God knows what was going to happen to his restaurant. So, and it was hilarious, actually, because his restaurant did fine. His parking lot sucked.
Yeah, well.
And there they tore down a whole neighborhood part to, so anyway, it was kind of, that was rare. Most everyone sort of just got along.
There is a restaurant in Corktown that I have always heard about as their opening was an inflection point and turning point in the neighborhood, and that is Slow's, the barbecue place.
Yep.
Tell me about that coming in 2002.
We had a really entrepreneurial executive director for the Corktown Development Corp. Greater Corktown Development Corp sort of merged with a housing corporation that had built some other housing development. And this fellow, Scott Martin, had a real edge to him about trying to be entrepreneurial, trying to sustain the nonprofit. And so he strategically got us involved, the board members and staff, into knocking on doors of people who owned those storefronts that were derelict, and then creating a development, an economic development department or committee, and on that committee there were people who were entrepreneurs in our lives, and had a strategy to kind of interview folks and talk to people about what they wanted to do and see if we could sell off those storefronts. And indeed, we crafted that into finding Phil Cooley, who I believe was kind of at the same bar sometime close to closing. I think it was the Lager House, PJ's, and Scott had conversations with him, and Phil was kind of newly coming into town and wanted to get something going, had a spark. And so through the conversation that the committee had, Phil seemed to be the right fix. We also got the Mercury Bar that way through another method, and we did 6 storefronts and Mercury Bar, and that was a strategy to generate some youth and excitement and entrepreneurial opportunity. And our office at the time was in the CPA building, which is now boarded up and empty, but at the time was functioning. And we kickstart. And then from that, we developed the strategy for Tiger Stadium site, for cultural tourism and development, along with crafting something for the train station, trying to find a new buyer. And we weren't necessarily excited about the police station going in there, but at least we said the current owner was not going to own it, and we had a breath of fresh air. All of these sites, with the Workers' Row House now, that sort of puts together a rather strong economic development strategy for cultural tourism. And to sustain the Workers' Row House is to develop tours, to have tours and exhibits, not to be a house museum where hardly anybody goes,
right,
that once you've been there, you don't go back.
Right.
But to partner with development like the Historical Society and have exhibits at the Historical Museum, which is sort of a great exhibition space. And then we partnered with the Wayne State Department of Anthropology. We initiated archaeological digs at the Workers' Row House, then do 2 other residential digs, which then gave 4 people their master's degrees. Okay.
So what
Yeah.
happens at an architectural dig? Archaeological dig at a row house. I mean,
Yeah, what are some of the
I'm
things
thinking
you
like
found?
you're looking for dinosaur bones, or
you go into the toilet. The privy.
Yeah.
Because the privy was where they threw stuff out. So you dig that stuff up, and then you begin to kind of understand from the fragments, you get little messages, and you find out what they bought and why they bought it. And was it a set? Might have been. And if it was a set, that meant these people are thinking about staying here instead of moving on. Because when you move in the 1850s and 60s, you don't carry much with you.
Right.
And so it starts to kind of congeal a depth of the history of that. It's a resource for the neighborhood. We're partners with the Museum of Anthropology at Wayne State. We're community partners. We're not a museum, the Workers' Row House. We partner with museums. We're an event space to take that information, shape it into programs and tours that can generate an income at that site so it's sustainable and interesting.
Right, and engaging, and like you said,
Exactly.
people want to come back and do more
Exactly.
things.
Right.
So that's part of the reason to have the exhibit at the Detroit Historical Museum, right?
Exactly.
Just to build that awareness.
Right.
And
Hardly anybody has known about it. There was a period of time when the housing market, tanked. The Greater Corktown Development Corp. Unfortunately closed its doors.
Yeah.
And when they did that, the inexperience of the board at the time didn't realize they would lose their federal housing status, and they did. And they sat, and the Workers' Row House by that time, transferred over to ownership. There was just a committee running this research and developing its sustainable model in time. The Workers' Row House sat stagnant for almost 6 years with no activity. And so recently, the transfer due to the restrictions on the deed, had to go to another nonprofit. And so the nonprofit, Greater Corktown Development Corp., that was initiated in 2014, finally got the property in 2016, in January of 2016. And since that time, we've now started to create our own nonprofit built on some of the participants in the committee that was harbored in the Greater Corktown Development Corp. So we're trying to build our capacity. We're trying to create these interesting stories now coming out of the research, which is pretty engaging. We also led to the dig at Roosevelt Park in front of the train station. So that collection, that's another exhibit opportunity at the Museum of Anthropology. That's cross-marketing for our effort. We can create events and tours around that subject matter and events at the space. We just had a poetry slam yesterday, Sunday. The 23rd. That's the second one we had at the site. The first one we had at the site a year ago. The second one we had in the gallery at the Historical Museum, where we get artists, writers, painters, whoever, coming to us. We get a stipend of some sort to them for them to respond to the history, their story, even though they might not have a relative. And we have names of the residents who lived there from 1850 to 1950. Even though you may not have lived there, somehow or another your family shares in that heritage, that journey to where you are now. And by looking at the material, by hearing the stories of other people, no relative, you can kind of make a connection to it. So if you can express it in a poem, if you can express it in music, if you can express it in painting or sculpture, is what we're trying to engage and have that sort of new excitement generated from somebody else's history, if you will.
Right, that's really
But we
beautiful.
share that. Everyone, you're either Native American, unfortunately slave, or an immigrant.
Right.
And somehow or another, even the African American poets have this interesting connection to the story from a completely different point of view. It's very engaging.
I love that. You even have a family connection to a building right there, right?
And to Corktown, who knew?
That you didn't even know about.
I didn't know about it. My wife and I bought the apartment building, and we're in it for a couple of years. We were a little embarrassed because we worked on the renovation from the inside out, so we opened it up for a home tour to show our neighbors that something was happening.
Oh, rather than the outside that didn't look as good. Okay.
Right. So we opened it up, and through the research, we found out that a great-great-uncle of mine built it in 1906. And then,
That's incredible.
My family kind of got a little excited about it, and they said, well, here's the Bibles. And lo and behold, the McKay boys, there were 7 brothers, okay, and they lived on 13th Street, just up the street from where the Gaelic League is now, in Corktown.
Oh, wow.
Now, I'm going to admit on air that McKay is not necessarily Irish. It's McKay.
Okay.
So, but I'm only saying that because I'm hopeful not a lot of people from Corktown neighbors hear that.
So what is the status of the Corktown Workers Row House now? Is it a space that's open? Can people tour it?
We can only open it on special occasions. It's gutted. We did the exterior we restored the 1849 elements to the house. And that was a conscious decision by the committee. It had structural issues. We put a new roof on it, and the exterior is done. In the process of shoring up the structure, we had to gut the interior. So the interior is down to basics, 2x4, bare. But you see the structure, which is kind of interesting. We only open it up on special occasions when we can afford the insurance for that special occasion. We have it open for almost all of the historic tours that the Corktown Historical Society has in the first Sunday in June. And when we initiate our tours of Corktown and Southwest Detroit, we will include on some of those tours of the interior, and we usually only go into one unit.
Let's play a little game. Tim, are you ready?
I guess.
Okay. All right, here we go. We're going to ask you for a series of rapid-fire recommendations. Just say the first thing that comes to your mind. Starting with this. If I want to go to brunch in Corktown, where's a great place to go?
PJ's Lager House started it. Brooklyn's pretty good. Brooklyn Street Local. And Bobcat Bonnie's is newer place. But it's hard between those three. I've been to three of them. It's really hard.
We might go brunch hopping.
Yeah. we
Well,
should.
and Mudgee does a
Mudgee's.
darn good job. And Farm.
Oh, yeah.
Or Folk,
Folk.
rather.
Yeah.
Folk.
Yeah.
I haven't been there yet for brunch.
Oh, it's so good.
That's what I've heard.
Yes.
Anyway.
Okay, so you know a lot about these different times in history. If you had a time machine and could actually go back to one of those points of historical Detroit, what year would you go back to, and why?
Holy moly. I'd probably like to go back to about 1926 because the dynamics of downtown, one of the greatest losses of Detroit is Paradise Valley.
Oh, yeah.
And I would have liked to have been around for that.
So I wasn't here in 1926. What's
neither.
Paradise Valley?
Paradise Valley was the urban core of business, entrepreneur, and entertainment for the black community.
That was displaced by the highway?
Exactly.
Yes.
Strategically.
Hastings Street.
Right.
Strategically.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that didn't lead to any bad things happening later on, did it?
Oh, no. Because they were all shipped over to 12th Street.
12th and Claremont.
Yeah. Hey.
Where is the first place that you take out-of-town visitors when they come to the area?
There isn't one. I start downtown since we're close. I mean, we're just a little bit more than a mile out of town, and I start where it started, and go from there.
Where downtown? A particular building? A particular?
No, if it depends on how much time they have. I'll go into buildings if they have time. If they don't have time, I try to give them a view of how this city is, what it is, and how it's grown from the core of downtown.
You've learned tons about Detroit. What's a weird trivia fact that you like to share?
The Gem Theater was moved 6 blocks to its current location.
Oh, yeah.
You were involved
I
in
was going to say.
Yeah.
with the Gem Theater, right? Tell us about that.
The Grand Circus Park Development Association was coming to be when Chuck Forbes started buying up theaters. At one point during Preservation Week, I had keys to all of the theaters and had tours of the theaters. And one of the theaters that I looked out from my little apartment building that I was owned, I could see the Gem Theater. And Chuck wasn't certain about saving the Gem. And he had bought the Fox. I was working with some folks who were saving Orchestra Hall before the Symphony moved there. Symphony was a Johnny-come-lately to saving Orchestra Hall. I brought Jeff Montgomery, who was working on saving Orchestra Hall. I brought him to the table. David Clements was a Cass City Cinema guy. He was interested in saving the Gem. And we pooled together, and on Saturday mornings for about a year, we sat down and talked to Chuck and tried to convince him to have this dynamic theater district. And he said, I don't want to do it. It's got a hole in the roof. So Mike O'Shea, who was from Stroh Legal Department, myself put together a nonprofit called Century Center Arts Association, C squared, A squared. And within 6 months, we got a grant for 20 grand. Those days are all gone.
Oh,
you
yeah.
don't get things
No.
that quickly anymore.
No.
But we got a grant and put a new roof on the Century, and Chuck bought it.
Wow.
And then he renovated it along with the Elwood, which was at Elizabeth and Woodward Avenue, and the gym and the Century Club were on Columbia, right around the corner, and the Fox and the State Theater. He owned them all. Then he had to sell off the Fox with his arm being twisted and a real raw attitude about it. And he got enough money that when it called for the demolition of that area because of Comerica Park, owned by the guy that bought the Fox, he had enough money to move that theater.
Wow.
Wow.
So we played a role. I mean, it really was Chuck Forbes who did it, but we played a significant role in it, and that was a real thrill for me.
For sure.
So let me ask you this. Is there any building out there now that if you could save it, you would?
Even if you have to move it 6 blocks.
Right, yes. you have a favorite that you're like, somebody should...
Well, the apartments on Cass Avenue, right by the new arena, those need to be saved, without a doubt. I'm glad that the Mackenzie House was saved, and I'm okay with it being moved. But I think those apartment buildings around the Cass Park and the arena area those are important.
All right.
Nicely done. I feel like we could ask you 1,000 more questions.
Yeah, we really could.
but
I learned a lot.
I learned a lot today. This is great.
I learned a lot. Tim McKay, the executive director of Corktown Experience. If people want to follow it or find out more, how can they do so
social
online?
media. website.
Social media for both Facebook for Workers Row House or Corktown Experience. CorktownExperience.com is not the greatest site yet, and Corktown Workers Row House .org is in taking shape.
In
Nice.
development. Okay.
Yes.
And go see the exhibit
Yes.
at the Detroit Historical Museum on
Please.
through July 7th.
Yeah, go check it
Yes.
out. Tim McKay, thank
Really
you
appreciate
so
this.
much for
Yeah.
joining us.
You're
This
welcome.
is
Thank
a lot
you.
of fun.
Yeah.
Until next time, Detroit's moving.
Keep up.
The D Brief.
Your guide to Detroit's arts and entertainment scene.